Hello, my name is Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, we put on Garden Masterclass. We thought we should put this little introduction to Garden Masterclass together for those of you who've not come across us before but have arrived at our YouTube channel. We aim to put on one-day educational events with the most creative and innovative people in the garden and landscape world up and down the British Isles, and that includes the Republic of Ireland. We've also started looking at putting on events on the European mainland, and this year we had one planned in France, one in Germany, and 3 in the Netherlands. Of course, our physical events this year are having to be rescheduled, but we're trying to do what we can online. Our events take place in garden environments where there's plenty to look at. And here we've got Nigel Dunnett, for example, in Trenton Gardens, discussing with a group the planting he has put together there. Or Sarah Price, the award-winning garden designer, talking about using drawing as a design tool at Treberwith Nursery in South Wales. Here, Marina Christopher, who runs a wonderful perennial nursery in the southeast of England at Parham House, talking about how she puts together perennials for effective planting design. And landscape architect and urban sketcher Liz Ackley talking about using drawing as a design tool for people in the landscape and garden design business. Since coronavirus has constrained what we do, we've gone online. Increasingly, we are hoping to run in-depth webinars. However, for the moment, what we're offering is every Monday and Friday at 4 o'clock London time, a broadcast, round about an hour, with information, education, and some entertainment. We talk with somebody from the garden world, we look at what they're doing, perhaps sometimes we'll have a panel. So far, we've had people from Britain, Ireland, Italy, and the United States. We've got plans to speak to people in Argentina, Ukraine, Lithuania, Japan, New Zealand. So we are pretty global. Our aim is to bring together gardeners all over the world to share experiences and see us through this difficult time. If you'd like to keep in touch, do please look at our website, or if you want to receive our occasional email newsletter, then do send us an email to gardenmasterclass@gmail.com and we'll put you on our mailing list, which of course will go no further than us. So we hope to meet you online, and hopefully one day we may even meet you in the flesh. Goodbye, stay safe and enjoy this particular recording.
Introduce today's guest.
Great, thank you, Annie. One of the peculiarities, one of the rather nice aspects actually of the garden world is that so many great gardeners have also been, if not at least good writers, at least very keen to write down about their experiences. And if you comparing this with other activities, I was thinking, for example, of great artists or great musicians who've also been good writers and good at explaining what they do. And I couldn't really come up with very many, whereas so many gardeners seem to be very quick to put pen to paper. Just thinking in British terms, John Evelyn, Russell Page, Christopher Lloyd, Penelope Hobhouse in Germany, Carl Förster, in the United States, the last few decades, James Van Sweden and Dan Hinckley have both made really big impacts on US gardening, and they've both been pretty quick to, if not put pen to paper, at least fingers to keyboard. And of course, in the case of Dan Hinckley, anyone who ever saw those fantastic Heron's Wood nursery catalogues will remember his wonderful, quirky writing style. So, of course, writers need publishers, which was where today's guest comes in. Anna Mumford, who is a, could I use the word, veteran garden publisher or garden editor. I've been writing a long time, and so I've known Anna a long time. And Anna's had a long history as an editor of garden books, and she now runs her own garden specialist publishing company, Filbert Press. So I think Anna, would you like to tell us how you got into this, admittedly rather specialist field?
Yeah, sure. So it was by chance, really. I was working at the time for Hamlin and Mitchell Beazley, who were part of a big media group, and it was a sort of slightly chaotic time when there was a lot of restructuring and everyone's moving desk. And I was working in illustrated non-fiction, but on a wide range of subjects, from step-by-step art books to health books, how to give up smoking, and even a book on the paranormal. So we had to kind of turn our hand to all sorts of different topics. But at some point, the gardening editor, the Mitchell Beazley gardening editor, left, and left behind her a kind of wonderful library of books. And my next desk happened to be by that rather wonderful library of books. And so there I sat working on, I think it was the Larousse Encyclopedia of Gardening. And because I had all these books behind me, everyone thought I was the gardening editor. And so I kind of became the gardening editor. And then by the time I moved to David and Charles, which was my next job, I was hired as the gardening editor. So that's how it all started. And you'll remember, Noel, from those days, because I think you wrote a book for Mitchell Beazley, maybe on conservatory plants or something like that.
Wasn't that architectural plants?
It might have been.
It was.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it was the time, the books I published there were Bob Flowerdew's first book on organic gardening. At the time, it was kind of thought to be a really kind of quite revolutionary thing that, was quite unusual. Nobody thought it would stay around. And I remember kind of researching through the Henry Doubleday Research Association and Soil Association. There were these little kind of regional societies, and Bob was headed up the one in Norfolk. And I tracked him down, and at some point turned up at his house, and we started talking about the book. And he already had just such an extraordinary, magnificent veg and fruit garden with about 16 raised beds, with everything in sort of top condition and looking wonderful, and presented me with a lunch of rather nice asparagus and salad leaves from his garden. And then we published one of Joy Larkham's books. Probably people will know her for her books on salads for small gardens and vegetables for small gardens. And she also had done a trip to the US, I think, recently, and we published her book. It was called Ornamental Vegetable Gardening, which was a really lovely book. And then Hugh Johnson was an author there. His Encyclopedia of Trees was a real classic that we kept republishing, reprinting. So yeah, that's where it all started. And from there, as I said, I went to David and Charles, and gradually became more and more kind of specialized, because they already had a pretty solid foundation in the gardening field. They were already publishing the Gardener's Guide series, which you'll remember again, Noel, the Graham Rice and Elizabeth Strangman book on hellebores, and many other old favorites in there. So I commissioned a lot of books in that series, which was a really wonderful experience, because it meant kind of going to see all these national collection holders and learning about salvias and whatever the next plant was.
You must have met a lot of plant nerds.
I met a lot of plant nerds. I did, yeah.
I mean, in some cases, I can imagine it must have been perhaps a little bit difficult to, sort of borderline issue. Are we going to publish this? Are we not? That must be difficult, mustn't it? Especially when you've got somebody who's just so knowledgeable about one particular area.
Yeah, that's true. Kind of getting the perspective and being able to open a subject out to a sort of wider audience is one of the real skills, isn't it?
Yes.
In all kinds of books, I suppose, but particularly in gardening, where you can become quite obsessed, let's say, by a certain plant.
Yes. Yeah, I think we've all met those people.
Yeah. So Yeah, David and Charles, they also published all the Hillier books, so the Hillier Manual of Trees and Shrubs, which was Roy Lancaster's, one of his projects when he was working at Hillier Nurseries. And they had David and Charles published a whole raft of kind of Hillier-inspired titles. And I also published Bunny Guinness's first book, Family Gardens, while I was at David and Charles, which was it kind of represented a bit of a sort of sea change, I think, in terms of gardening books. It was the kind of book that was about, where you were in a sort of almost a lifestyle gardening book, I suppose. It was more about where you were in your life, and if you had small children around, how you didn't have to have a garden full of plastic. You could make wonderful kind of willow teepees and tree houses and all this kind of thing.
So that was quite a sea change, then, you think?
Yeah, it was. But the backbone of that list really were the gardener's guides, and it was from there that I met Timber Press, the American publisher, Timber Press, and got to know Neil Mallett, who bought the American rights to every one of those guides and published them in the US. Mm-hmm. And there was there was a really good synergy between the two companies. Yes. Because Timber had found that, these kind of quite specialized books that were not monographs, they were not sort of botanical monographs, but nor were they kind of general run-of-the-mill gardening books. They were kind of filled a little niche in between the two, really had a keen audience because, again, as we know, people who love plants really love them, and they don't just want one hosta, but they want loads of hostas. And in fact, at one point at Timber, I think we had about 5 hosta books on the list.
5 hosta books?
Yeah.
People say there are too many varieties of hosta, getting too many books about hostas.
Yeah. Yeah, they're very popular in the US. Yes. And working for Timber Press was different again, even more specialized. And you mentioned Dan Hinckley, and his book, The Explorer's Garden, was one of the first books I read when I went to Timber Press, and I was just looking at it again this morning. And it's just such a wonderful piece of writing.
Yes.
I think it was the first time that I realized, because I had I have a kind of English literature, literary background. That's what I studied at university.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time I kind of saw that, these sort of book writing about plants could really have this sort of literary quality about it.
Yes.
And you're basically sort of caught up from the first page, even if you've never heard of these plants, just for the way he describes when he first saw them on his travels or in a nursery, and then kind of brings them back to grow in his garden.
Yeah.
So that was a really, really interesting, exciting place to work. They had books on the list that have been there for, real titans of gardening publishing, like fir trees, Japanese maples, which I think even when I was there had been in print for 30 years. Yeah. And Rick Dark's books on ornamental grasses, his book on American woodland garden. I mean, these were people who were huge enthusiasts, hugely knowledgeable, writing about what they loved, and it's hard to pick them up and not get absorbed in them, really.
So did that involve many trips to Portland, Oregon?
It did. Yeah, I went every year for the time that I worked there, over 14 years. So I got to know Portland pretty well and enjoyed the city hugely.
No, it's an amazing place, isn't it? Quite.
Yeah. In fact, you and Nigel Dunnett wrote Planting Green Roofs and Living Walls, yes, didn't you, for Timber Press? And then he followed that with a book on rain gardens. Right. And some of the, I forget what the park is called, but there's an amazing sort of amazing examples of water management in Portland. Yeah. That's it, Tanner Springs Park. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that was so inspiring, particularly when you're also working on a book about it.
Yes, yes.
So, but yeah, I mean, that started, there were some strands at Timber, and one of them was the plant reference books, or books about plants. The other was books about public planting, which Nigel's books really opened my eyes to, and ecologically led planting. Yeah, and again, that was partly Nigel's books, but also Keith Wiley's book on the wild side. That was my first venture in this so-called naturalistic planting, ecologically led planting.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, somebody that, I imagine some of these people are fairly unstoppable when they write. Others, I could imagine, are possibly rather difficult to get them to commit to deadlines, or do people sometimes need coaching? Or
yeah, I mean, first-time authors can need more coaching than others. I guess it starts right at the beginning. I mean, one of the most difficult parts, I think, as we touched on before, can be that you know your subject really well and you're really involved in it, but it's hard to kind of see how to bring that to other people because you're so much in it.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So sometimes it just takes a sort of outsider to say, oh, the things I think are interesting are these 5 strands, and that's how it should be organized. That can be one of the things that's needed. Then sometimes, I mean, it's just hard for everybody. I think I'm always full of admiration that gardeners find the time to write. I mean, you talked about this earlier, and you know, they're so adaptable. You know, they're really good at their subject. They spend hours in their garden, and we all know how time consuming those can be. And then finding time to put that down on paper too, and then stick with it for the year or 2 years that it takes through the life of a book, meticulously proofreading, correcting plant names, and you know, all these different qualities you need to be a garden writer, and so many great people do have it.
Mm-hmm. And questions just come up, but I think it's nice to pitch in now. How do you find new writers? And the publishing goes in 2 ways. I mean, there can be somebody who, I want to write a book about blah, but also I know from my own experience with yourself and other people I've known in the publishing industries is thinking, oh, we've got to find good new writers, and that itself. How do you go about that? Your perspective.
So it's a mix of those 2 things. So I'm working within quite a specialised area, although for me it doesn't feel that specialised because I've sort of identified the books that I go for, which are books about plants, books about gardens, books about practical subjects that inspire new garden projects, and then books that are to do with outdoor activities like scything, growing mushrooms and so on. So I'm always sort of talking to people and reading, obviously, and being aware of what's going on in those kind of niches. And some people come to me with an idea or just want to chat through an idea. And then sometimes I hear about somebody and I'll call them and we'll have a conversation and see if they want to write a book or they might want to at some point in the future. And it's not for everybody, but it's always worth having a conversation, and it's generally really fun to have those conversations about, you know, what people are doing in their gardens, what they're interested in, and whether it might be the right time for them to write a book.
Are people realistic about money? I mean, I dare say there's the odd person you've come across who thinks they're going to make a fortune and have to be rapidly disabused.
I think people are a bit more realistic now, perhaps now that people are online writing blogs and, you know, information is out there, and people are doing all of that for sometimes quite little, little remuneration, but a lot of positives come with it, don't they? The sort of, it can be a fantastic way to kind of promote another part of your business, or just some people really want to get it down. They want to put a marker down about what they know, and a book can be a very satisfying way of doing it. We were talking the other day, weren't we, about how a book differs from other ways of gaining information online, or listening to talks like this, or going to see people talk and so on. And there's of course there's the physicality of a book, which I think people like, you know, what it feels like, and just perhaps to get away from the screen sometimes and take in information in a slightly different way. And then also I think it's something very permanent, isn't it? You can't go back and change it. So it really is this kind of moment in time when you're at a particular stage in your gardening life or what you've achieved. And then, as we talked about, you know, some books are really, they are there and loved for decades.
And of course, there was always that slightly moment when I was slightly dread some God society meeting, and somebody comes out with a book you wrote like a zillion years ago, and said, Mr. Kingsbury, in you said blah. Oh, did I really?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, so I mean, Timber Press, of course, were interesting, and I always remember them as having been very seriously specialist publishers, but it has to be said, not fantastically designed books. But then, in the kind of post-Kindle world, they started to actually really up the game in terms of their design value. So the books became, and this is across the industry, wasn't it? Books became really within quite a short period just so much more beautiful to handle.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true.
So, any particular? You've got a pile of books behind you.
Oh, can you see my pile of books?
Yeah. A pile of books. I'm sure you were going to be waving some of these around.
Yeah. Well, of course, I've got my Filbert Press books here in prize.
Well, they're in the front of course. Yes, we understand.
I've got some of the co-editions here also, because that's quite an interesting aspect of publishing. Such an international industry, and that's true. I really love that about it, and it's true of the authors on my list. I have an Austrian mushroom expert and a German expert in natural swimming pools and a French expert in Mediterranean plants, and I just think it's so great that you write in your own language, and then it can be translated, and the same information can inspire people all over the world. And that's quite a big part of my business at Filbert Press, is to sell rights, to buy and sell rights. And that happens at 2 book fairs, the first in spring at London Book Fair, a second in autumn at Frankfurt Book Fair.
That's been going since more or less Gutenberg printed the first Bible, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Frankfurt's a big place for trade fairs. I meet people who go to carpet trade fairs there and all sorts of things, and I imagine it's much the same, just huge halls. It's a bit like an airport, and there are 8 halls, and you're always kind of running to meetings, because meetings happen every 30 minutes with no break in between. So you're kind of tearing from the French hall to the German hall and then back to the UK hall. And it was on one of those trips that I found Olivier Philippi's book, which was called Alternative au Gazon, which is about alternatives to the lawn. And we published it. It's so much more than alternatives to the lawn that I kind of turned the title on its head a bit and called Planting Design for Dry Gardens, because the alternatives to the lawn are so exciting. They're about plants that grow in among paving and cobbles and down stairways, and a lot of times he's inspired by kind of old sheepfolds and goat farms that he's seen on his travels around the Mediterranean hills in Crete and the Greek islands and so on. And it's such a beautiful book that I was very, very keen to publish it. And it was actually the first book I published at Filbert Press. And that's the kind of thing that you do at a book fair. That's the buying side of it. And then the selling side is I take samples, either finished samples or sort of early spreads of a book, and show them to like-minded publishers. So that's what I'd have done with Nigel's book, Planting Design. This one, Planting Design. The Naturalistic Planting Design, which I published last year, and is now in Dutch. There's the Dutch one. And French, similar but a little bit different. And then just publishing this year, this is in proof form still, the German edition. So those are the results from kind of several meetings with publishers at various book fairs.
It's always used to be, I dare say things have changed now, but certainly in the 90s till the sort of early 2000s, it almost seemed that no British publisher would publish until they had a North American co-edition. Now, the US market, so important, and only once that deal was sewn up would they really publish, and then the translations into European languages always came later.
Yeah,
that's probably changed a lot now.
I think it's still probably maybe true of sort of trade titles, books that are less specialized, where you need the numbers to be higher, the print numbers to be higher, and so it's important to get a co-edition sale on before you can publish. But it's not the area of publishing I'm in, because it's my area of publishing is more specialized.
Yes. We got a question, in fact, how much you oversee photography and illustrations for the project, and how much do you, the whole kind of design and visual aspect, which, let's face it, when people first pick up a book, that's what they look at before they read it. For the really majority of sales, I'm sure. I mean, how much do you get involved with all of that?
Yeah, so it's a huge, it is a huge team effort, a book, although it's often the author that proposes a book to a publisher. The photos that go in it and the illustrations that go in it and the designer who makes the book are such a big part of what it is. Well, as a publisher, I oversee, I'm a bit like a project manager, I suppose. I oversee all of that. I suppose it's a personal view that I like to give experts, whether they're photographers or illustrators or writers, as much sort of creative freedom as possible. So it's about sort of managing these sometimes quite kind of fast moving creative beings. I think your book with Jimmy Blake was a really lovely example of how that all came together.
Yes, I was so pleased with this. I mean, it was a really dynamically designed book.
Yeah, it was designed by Michelle Knoll at Studio Knoll, and she's a great collaborator. I really love working with her.
There's some very, very zappy design in there.
Yeah, she's an enthusiast. She's a plant enthusiast, and the end papers just kind of take hold of you right from the start, and they just feel so much right for Jimmy and Jimmy's garden. And I love it when a book kind of really reflects the personality and kind of what's special about the author. But every book is different. Our book about the out-of gardens at Hauser and Worth was a result of, I think, almost 5 years of Jason Ingram going there, early in the morning, late in the evening, to catch these absolutely beautiful landscapes in perfect light, and just hours and hours of dedication and brilliance. And then other books come with photos. So Olivier Philippi takes all his own photos. Everyone is different, and that's what makes them so exciting.
We've got quite a few questions backing up here.
Yes, one from Caleb Melchior about what your goals are for Filbert. I mean, what makes a Filbert Press book? Is there a sort of...
So what makes Filbert Press book? I'm always looking for people who are experts and looking to go a bit deeper into a subject. So although I probably wouldn't do a book on wildlife gardening, which is a big topic at the moment, I might do a book that's some aspect of wildlife garden, just going in that bit closer as something that is personally interesting for me, and also fills a niche that I think sometimes more mainstream books can't do, because they're trying to fit so much into a certain number of pages, and that means that topics are quite, the text on them is quite light. There's not a lot of depth. So I'm always looking for experts, people who spent lives doing their life for a long time doing something very interesting and have a particular view about it, and feel ready to write a book. I publish books. I mean, I have these areas that I like to publish in, books about plants, books about gardens, particularly where the garden, I mean, a lot of publishers find it difficult to sell books about a single garden, but I think that books about single gardens, if they have something about them that other people can take to their own gardens. So sometimes it, they need to stand back and say, okay, what it is that's really special about my garden, then that can work really well. And then practical books, I think people love to hear, really in-depth practical books like our book on natural swimming pools, where you literally could make a natural swimming pool by reading that book. I think are really, really exciting. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of tables, a lot of chemical equations, great plants, incredible level of detail in them, but, just worth their weight in gold, really. Or they're wonderful if you're going to hire a professional to do it for you and you want to know what questions to ask them and make sure you're fully briefed about what's involved.
I mean, to what extent are you in the business of spotting upcoming horticultural trends? I mean, we've got a question here about if you can see what's on the horizon.
Yes, I mean, we're all trying to do that all the time, aren't we? And I think we all know that there's a sort of an overlap, a really interesting overlap between nature, the environment, and gardening at the moment that I find is a sort of very lively kind of seam that I really am interested in publishing more in. And I don't think we've got anywhere near the end of that as people sort of experiment with different styles of naturalistic planting, different styles of gardening in a way that feels more in tune with the natural world and the immediate location around us. Feels like that's still quite in its infancy and is just going to grow and grow, with all the associated benefits to wildlife and reduced use of pesticide, fertilizer, inputs from water and all the rest of it.
Anna, somebody's asked how long you expect a book to take, and then followed on by, what sort of money is there in writing books? And I know two different questions, but from your expectations as the editor, the length of time an author should spend, or
so the average length of time from kind of agreeing what the book is and settling on, the first things to think about are really what's your book about, who's it for, how does it differ from other similar books on the market, and then I think crucially one final question you ask yourself is why do you want to write it? And probably if your answer to that is to make money, then probably you should think again, try some other way of making money. But I think the why do you want to write it is really important because it is a long process. It's probably a year in writing and photographing is the usual. It can sometimes be longer than that and it can sometimes be shorter. And then basically another year from all the materials being delivered to the publisher to holding the finished book in your hands. And a lot of really detailed work along the way that quite often, being gardeners and active people, you're doing on top of whatever else you do as a day job quite often. So yeah, it's a commitment.
And what's been your most successful title to date?
Filbert or throughout?
Well, I think it would be interesting to hear from both. I mean, from previously and from Filbert. Yeah.
So, I mean, we published, again, one of yours, Noel, at Timber. The book with Pete Adolf was very important. Planting a new perspective very well. Yeah. And it's a really important book. Rosemary Alexander's book on garden design, the Garden Design Workbook, has been in print for a really long time and sells very regularly. Yeah. There are some technical books, like, again, Nigel's book on planting green roofs, that continually sell every year, some copies. the kind of books that I publish are kind of in it for the long game. They're not, Monty Don's, that is kind of thousands of books in the first year, and then, then people are looking for the new thing. My book, the sort of books that, they're people who are constantly growing into gardening, coming onto being aware of what's out there and wanting, the final word on green roofs or natural swimming pools, and that gives them a really long life.
Well, compared to an awful lot of publishing, which for quite a long time now is the titles are only really meant to stay out there for really quite a short period of time. And I remember having a conversation with a company in London a few years ago. I was actually trying to tout the idea of a book on contemporary Dutch garden design, and I was told very quickly, oh no, people in Britain won't want to read about what the Dutch do, but we haven't done a book on small gardens for 5 years. Do you want to do that? And I just felt like I'm the right person, the right place at the right time. And I thought, well, actually, these Dutch gardens, they're all pretty small. Like if I'm not small gardens in Britain as well. And Maaike de Gidde, she's a really good photographer. So why not? And it was actually their main book for the year. And it was a really good little book to do, but it really was a case of, 5 years lifespan, then it's someone else's turn.
Yeah,
and it really is like that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I suppose because it's about fashion really and how it looks. A lot of that, the books.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Anna, obviously there's a lot of people listening today who are garden designers, landscape architects, gardeners, horticulturalists. And if what's your advice to somebody who has got an idea for a book that they think is a good, strong idea? What should their first move be? And where would they go? How should they find the right publisher that would work with them? What's your advice on that?
So I think if you ask yourself those first 4 questions that I said before, what's it about, who's it for, how does it differ from other similar books on the market, and why do you want to write it? And then once you've got that sort of clear in your head, I think a bit of sort of footwork on the internet by just looking at all the gardening publishers out there, looking at their websites, seeing what kind of books they publish, because everybody does have a bit of a sort of a niche and an emphasis. Or maybe your book is a kind of quite mainstream, first-time gardener type of book, then you need obviously to find a publisher that those kind of books work for, like Noel was just mentioning with his small gardens book. So it's really about sort of seeing what they publish, because that is really what they're going to be good at. That's going to be their thing. And then every publisher has different guidelines for submission. They're often on their website and they vary hugely, but there's often a sort of early stage. At Timber Press, we used to call it the glimmer, where you have a kind of glimmer of an idea and you write 3 paragraphs about what it is and who you are and why you want to write it. And then you have a chat with an editor about that, and they share it with the publishing team, talk to salespeople. And if it looks like it's got traction, then we editors would encourage the author to go back and put together a full-scale proposal. And that might give them some direction. And I mean, that I personally at Filbert Press think that's a good way to go. I wouldn't want or expect a fully blown proposal in the first instance, but something like a glimmer, which is 3 paragraphs about what the book's about, who it's for, what the competition is, and why you want to write it, is basically what I would be looking for.
And would you be looking favourably on people who've been writing for magazines, or who have a blog and who've got a little bit of track record? I mean, is that something you look for in the early stages of a? Yeah. I mean, that can be really, really helpful, because obviously it gives you a sense of how they can organise the subject they want to write about. But it's not always essential. I think most important is that it's a new and interesting idea. And what about if somebody is a garden photographer or illustrator and they want to find a publisher, or they want to marry up with somebody? How would they work from that angle?
Illustrators, I think, do tend to work across a wide range of genres just because of the nature of what they do. So not all of them, but those who don't probably, again, will be identifying all the gardening book publishers and seeing where their style might fit, or a number of them have agents. That's sometimes where we look to find our illustrators. And then photographers, probably you'd be best asking a photographer, somebody like Jason Ingram, what the best approach is. I just don't know. I know that there's a circuit of gardening photographers who are really great at what they do, and they do get used a lot. How you break into that circle, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it can be quite a competitive.
Yeah, quite hard, I think.
Yeah. And somebody has asked, what have you got that's up and coming? You're allowed to give us a glimpse into what's on the book, what's on the books, what's on your...
Yeah, so yeah, it's a really exciting one, actually. We're just putting the final touches to a book by Dan Pearson and Midori Shintani about the Tokachi Millennium Forest in Japan, which some of you might have heard of. It's an incredibly exciting project that began 30 years ago when Mr. Hayashi, a newspaper owner in Tokyo, bought a 240 hectare piece of land to offset his carbon footprint and return it to the sort of native flora after a sort of agricultural period had left it kind of clogged up with sasa bamboo. And Dan was invited to come and design the garden 10 years later, so in the year 2000. And it's a really dramatic kind of mountainous region with really harsh, deep winters and bears in the mountains, and monumental and massive. And one goal of Mr. Hayashi was to get people to visit, to bring in a sort of new generation of city dwellers who had become a bit detached with the sort of lives their grandparents lived in the country, where they grew their own food and were very much in tune with nature. And it was one of his goals to kind of try and bring back that closeness with nature. And I think in the early stages, it's such a massive site, they were finding that people would get to a certain point, but they wouldn't venture further out. And so Dan created, there are lots of different elements to the garden, but one is an earth garden with these massive sort of beautiful rolling earth mounds that draw people out from the kind of cafes and so on into the mountains. And then this huge perennial meadow, which is just beautiful and very reflective of the native flora. And then the forest is a sort of, you're gently sort of eased into the real forest, the real deep forest, with a sort of lightly managed forest where kind of floral diversity is encouraged. And there are, crossings over rivers and so on. So you sort of feel comfortable. It feels like a sort of garden space and less wild, and encourages you to explore. And the head gardener there is Midori Shintani, who some of you might have heard speak, and she's brilliant at, it's really a marriage of sort of East and West, a fusion of East and West horticultural techniques, and culture and aesthetics as well. So the Japanese mark 72 seasons of the year. And they do things like they hang ribbons in the trees to welcome the May breezes, and sort of to cool you down in May. And they mark the sort of moment that the miscanthus flowers sort of topple, I think, in the autumn winds. And all these different ways of sort of being in touch with nature and noticing what's happening, which we do here too. We were talking the other day about how, we notice it feels like it's wild garlic time, or it's bluebell woods time, or it's these times that we notice, but we don't mark them with quite such celebration as they do in Japan. So it's also about all these kind of things, and how the overlap between gardening and nature and our sort of immediate context is so important to us now, I think, wherever we live, even if it's a small garden in a small town.
And when do we expect to because I know it's eagerly awaited, so when?
Yeah, it's September 24th is publication day.
Great, fantastic. Gosh, there's going to be a lot of anticipation for that book.
Yes, it should be really very interesting. Midori is a quite extraordinary person.
Yeah.
And perennial growing, in Japan is well, there's no real history of perennial growing in Japan. And Dan always said to me, that garden would not have worked without Midori's ability to really think on her feet. And what's interesting is that developing the Tokachi Millennium Forest as a visitor's destination now seems to have kickstart a whole lot of other gardens in Hokkaido to do similar sort of things, because tourism there is one of the few economic activities other than forestry and agriculture. In fact, we are hoping to have a kind of a Hokkaido special with a couple of these, with Midori and another one of these gardeners at some point in the future, aren't we, Annie?
Yes, we certainly are. Yeah. There was a question that sort of a little way ago, which I think is quite interesting, and you don't have to sort of name a title, but what constitutes a good and successful sales number for a particular book? I mean, when it reaches a certain mark or a certain point, what does that kind of, whereabouts is that for a book?
It's just hugely depends on the publisher and the approach. I was sort of talking about this idea of a trade book, which is a sort of more mainstream book that would sell a lot in its first year, and then less in its second, and then maybe go into paperback, and then be kind of making room for the next one. I don't know, I suppose you'd want something like that to, it depends very much on the size of the company, but I imagine they sell between 7,500 and 10,000 copies a year. I mean, it's as long as a piece of string, really.
Yeah, sure.
Book sales go from 1,000 a year at the sort of very academic, highly botanical end of the scale, perhaps like the books that Q Publishing publish, through to I don't know, something like Carl Katie, perhaps, who maybe publish, I don't know, their print runs and numbers are perhaps more like between 10 and 20,000 a year.
Yeah. So I guess you have to try and forecast, I guess, when you're putting together a new project, potential sales over a few years, I guess, to figure out how to cost the whole project. Yeah. No, it's interesting, very interesting business, and quite complex, isn't it? Because when you team up with other publishing companies as well, it's quite a intricate business, isn't it?
There are a lot of variables and no certainties. There's quite a lot of risk involved, and that's what makes it interesting, partly, I suppose.
And generally speaking, in the publishing world, how what's the feeling about books as a tangible paper thing, as opposed to Kindle and online and screen? I mean, what's the feeling? Have you got a sort of feeling for how,
Yeah, I was looking at some figures earlier on, actually, and so independent bookshops are on the rise in 2019. I mean, 2019 was the third year in a row, I think, that there were the number of independent bookshops in the UK grew, not massively, but we now have something like 890 or 900. Yes. And books, or rather, value of books also grew in 2018 for the fourth year going. So value grew by 2% and volume grew by 0.3%. So it is just gently on the rise, which is very encouraging, I think.
Definitely.
Yes.
And any other titles that you can tease us with, or have you been completely flat out on the Hokkaido book?
I have been pretty flat out on the Hokkaido book, and I have been commissioning, and I have got 2 more for 2021, but it's probably a little bit early to reveal them just now. But I'm continuing to sort of publish. Probably 3 a year is my ideal, but it often goes in batches. So I had 5 last year and 1 this year, and but I'll have 2 or 3 next year, I hope.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Good, great. Well, there's no more questions. No. Well, thank you very much, Anna. That was I think it was a great insight into the production of books, which I think, if you're not in the industry, can seem somewhat mysterious. But which do play, of course, a very important part in our whole business, don't they? Books really have become really quite central to the gardening world, and having survived the arrival of the Kindle and the absence of any technology that really gives you any kind of equivalent to an illustrated book, I think books will be with us for a good long time to come, and I'm sure you'll be working on them for many years to come.
Excellent.
Great. And somebody, a message from Helen. So many of the books you've held up today mean so much to me. And of course, your own garden has benefited, I think, very much from
yeah, it has actually. Yeah, so I've got my Philippi border out the back, and I was just looking at what I've got in my perennial borders. So we sort of pulled up the grass and made kind of mini Udov-esque kind of perennial borders, and got some beautiful kind of Euphorbia mycenites, I think it is, that kind of tumbles down the hill. And I love this Salvia sclaria. It's not out yet, but it has, just a beautiful scent and smoky flowers. And I bought a really lovely dark purple salvia from Derry Watkins at a plant fair last year that I just put out, and excited to see that in flower. So
yeah, Derry's dangerously close to you, isn't she?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And did you manage to get across to Hokkaido during the making of this book at all?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Something, I've sort of held back from doing so that I'm kind of like the reader, really, just sort of experiencing it afresh and anew. But I'd really love to go one day.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, very interesting.
There's a nice comment from Joe Burns over in County Cork saying, "Thank you, Anna. There's nothing like opening a well-designed book."
Oh, great.
Great, good, great. Well, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for coming along this afternoon. Tomorrow we're back over the water.
Back over the water?
We're not saying which body of water we're going over or how far, but back over the water tomorrow. And hopefully see you tomorrow.
Yes, yeah. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks very much, Anna. That was really interesting.